Hopefully, you've become intrigued enough with the prayer that Jesus taught to read it, say it, think it, ponder it with new interest and meaning. Have you noticed this prayer has two parts? The first part, the first half, is about God's name, God's reign, God's will. God's name, identifying the one to whom we're praying. God's reign, or how God runs things for which God takes responsibility. And God's will, in other words, God's expectation for the ways of heaven to be so on earth. We considered the first half of the prayer the last couple of weeks, and I suggested, following John Dominic Crossan, the prayer Jesus taught is prayed, if it is prayed as Jesus intended it to be, to a just, loving God who establishes a world, then protects and provides for this world, running things fairly, making sure everyone has enough, giving special concern and care to the most vulnerable. I also said that as members of God's family, we are partners with God, sharing the responsibility with God of bringing justice into reality in our own time and place, making the ways of heaven to be so on earth. You might have noticed that the first half of the prayer is about the divine. The second half is about the human. And we begin this half thinking about, give us this day our daily bread. We pray this prayer so easily with so little thought, we forget the context of Jesus' life, the context which gave rise to the prayer itself. And without understanding the circumstances out of which the prayer arose, we cannot accurately understand its meaning in that time, nor can we grasp the dangers inherent in the words Jesus taught disciples to pray. Without understanding the circumstances out of which the prayer arose, we cannot fully grasp the meaning of the prayer in our own time, the commitment, the challenges, and perhaps the inherent dangers if our own praying of this prayer is done in the way that Jesus actually intended. You may remember the story of Chicken Little from last week, how Foxy Loxy leads Chicken Little and her companions to their demise in the form of a tasty dinner in his den. Foxy Loxy is focused only on his own needs and pleasures. Chicken Little and companions are caught up in their misinterpretation of an acorn falling on the head of Chicken Little, and while they're frantically running around crying, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling," they allow their own fear to distract them. And losing their sense of reason and focus, they become vulnerable to the seductive offers for help, failing to see the dangers of following Foxy Loxy, dangers that have costly effects. Interestingly, Jesus calls Herod Antipas that fox. Antipas, a ruler from Rome, another being who wants it all for himself, taking advantage of others for his own personal and political gain. In attempts to secure his political standing and future, Antipas exploits the land, the water, the sea, trying to increase productivity in order to win the favor of the Roman Empire. He commercializes the fishing industry on the Sea of Galilee, renaming it the Sea of Tiberias after the Roman emperor, and institutes heavy taxes. All of this brings major changes to the fishing village along the shore, worsening the conditions for the people in an economically depressed area. An area which already includes many peasants, mostly living at subsistence levels, as well as others living with the ever-present danger of slipping from being small landowners to tenant farmers to day laborers. This is the setting Jesus chooses for much of his ministry, the place and circumstances from which many of Jesus' disciples come, a place where ruler Antipas operates in ways Jesus considers unfair, not right, and not in line with the will of God. A ruler who is not in partnership with God in bringing the ways of heaven to be so on earth. Antipas maneuvered, trying to strike a precarious balance between the local people and productivity. He needed high productivity if he was going to impress Rome, but on the other hand, an uprising of the locals would look bad to the Roman government. This is the context in which the Jesus movement comes into being, the place where Jesus proclaims a different way, the place where he calls others to join him in making the ways of heaven to be so on earth. The Jesus movement is highly political. It's about who owns the earth, the land, the lake, God or Rome. This Jesus movement is about who owns the food produced in and on the earth, the land, the lake. If productivity increases, who is to benefit? For Antipas, the goals are his own political gain and enhancing the reign of Rome. For Jesus, the goals are spreading God's reign on earth and taking responsibility for feeding the people. With the reign of God already present on earth, part of the responsibility given to Jesus' followers is the adequate and fair distribution of food. If Jesus' disciples are ready to teach, but not also to feed, they've missed Jesus' message. Because teaching and feeding are inseparable. They just cannot be separated out one from the other. Jesus is intent on establishing God's way more fully throughout the world, bringing the ways of heaven to be so on earth. Assuring things are done fairly and everyone has enough is the mission of Jesus. Assuring things are done fairly and everyone has enough becomes the mission of Jesus' disciples. It becomes our mission, the mission of Christians, those trying to follow Jesus. Jesus lived and Jesus died, insisting the world and its food and its water belong not to Rome, but to God. Insisting this food and water belonging to God have to be shared fairly among all people. Jesus' ministry was all about insisting the ways of God have precedence over the ways of Rome. This was the focus of Jesus' life, and for this insistence, Jesus was killed. In the prayer Jesus taught, we pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." We don't pray, "Give me my." We pray, "Give us our." Give us this day our daily bread. All of God's people should have a fair share of God's food from God's earth. An earth where there is more than enough food already on the earth, more than enough is already present, more than enough is already available. That is, if the food is just food. And by just food, I mean food that is fairly grown, fairly harvested, and fairly distributed and shared. And if we also remember, we pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Focused on daily food and justice for all people right now, this day, rather than hoarding for ourselves for some future time at the expense of sisters and brothers whose current needs right now, this day, are not being met. Jesus in life and death, before and after the resurrection, is always about God's food in God's world for all of God's people. Jesus always and forever is about justice. All of this is packed into the little phrase we pray so often, "Give us this day our daily bread."